This episode is dedicated by Time Ghost Army Brigadier Randy Warmeister to his parents, Grace and William, who fought in the Dutch resistance. More on that later. April 13th, 1945. He's guided his country's path through the war since it entered the war years ago, but he shall do it no longer. For this week, American President Franklin Roosevelt dies. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Americans made landings on Okinawa, which were unopposed, though hundreds of kamikaze planes attacked the landing fleet offshore. In China, the Japanese were pushed back. Also in Burma, a whole German army group was surrounded in the Ruhr. The Soviets attacked both Vienna and Königsberg, and the preliminaries began for Operation Grapeshot, the Allies' new offensive in Italy. The bombardment began back on the 6th, but on the 9th, bombers hit the support zone behind the Elbe River defenses and hit it hard, even as the artillery continues. The 3rd Carpathian, 2nd New Zealand, and 8th Indian Infantry Divisions from British 8th Army attack as the sun goes down, hoping to cross the Senio and reach the Santerno. The New Zealanders reach it first, the night of the 10th, then the Indians and Poles the 11th, by which time the New Zealanders have already made a crossing. The morning of the 12th, 78th Infantry Division passes through 8th Indian for an attack on Argenta. 24th Guards Brigade from 56th London Infantry Division launch an amphibious attack to the right of the Argenta Gap, and that battle gets going. But they get held up as this week ends, as does 78th Division on the Reno River. 5th Army to the west is to begin its attacks tomorrow. They were supposed to begin the 12th, but heavy fog that day and today has pushed it back. I mentioned that German army group surrounded in the Ruhr. The Allies spend this week launching concentric attacks against what is a very much outgunned, outmanned, and outsupplied enemy. The attacks are by elements of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, and they reach the famous Krupp factories the 9th. The pocket is compressed ever smaller, and by the 11th is half the size it was back when it was created on the 1st. That evening, elsewhere in the West, American tanks of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division reach the Elbe River. A recon group hits the suburbs of Magdeburg, which surprises the residents going on about their days. The surprise does not extend to the city's defenses, however, and once they are alerted, taking the Autobahn bridge north of the city off the march is out of the question. To the south at Schönebeck, German engineers blow the bridge at dawn the 12th, but between there and Magdeburg at Westerhusen, Combat Command D from 2nd Armored have 3 battalions across by that evening. They use a cable ferry to try to build up their eastern bridgehead with some artillery and armor, but elements of Walter Wenck's 12th Army, largely made up of very young men and even just cadets, push the Americans off the eastern bank. 2nd Armored then rolls back and heads south to join U.S. 83rd Division at Barbie, where they've just crossed and set up a pontoon bridge. So finally this evening, men and armor pour across the Elbe. Things look to the commanders like they can continue with the same momentum as before and just cruise on to Berlin. However, the orders come to stop, to halt, and to hold fast on the eastern banks of the Elbe. 9th Army is not to drive for Berlin. The orders come from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, down to 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley, down to 9th Army Commander Bill Simpson, down to 2nd Armored Division Commander Sidney Hines. Over this night, Ike, that's Eisenhower, transmits his operational plans to Washington, D.C. His drive into central Germany has been a success, and what he plans to do now is hold on the Elbe, attack north towards Lübeck and Denmark, also attack south into the Danube Valley, and destroy any national redoubt that might be forming, and link up with the Soviets. Taking Berlin does not fit into any of these operations. The 83rd Infantry Division signposts the bridge at Barbie, the Truman Bridge, named after the President of the United States. Oh yes, Harry Truman is the President of the United States. For on April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, in the first year of his 4th term as president, dies, and Vice President Truman is sworn in as president. Roosevelt's been in poor health for several months, and the afternoon of the 12th, he complains of a serious headache before suddenly falling unconscious. He dies of a massive stroke at 3:35 in the afternoon. He is 63 years old. Roosevelt took office March 4th, 1933, which is just 33 days after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. Man, the world's changed a lot since then. Anyhow, speaking of Hitler, Roosevelt's death provokes wild exultation among Hitler's crowd, with Joseph Goebbels crying, "This is the turning point!" This is only amplified by Wenck's forces pushing the Americans back, and the usual talk flies. Victory between the Elbe and Oder, secret weapons turning the tide, the Western Allies fighting against the Soviets. But what they don't talk about is any impending battle for Berlin. The morning of the 13th, Hitler sort of addresses this with a proclamation to his Eastern Front troops that they will destroy the enemy at the gates to Berlin, and Vienna will soon be retaken. This proclamation is to be released when the Soviets attack, and that is to be very soon. I said last week that, contrary to what he told the Western Allies, Joseph Stalin is going to launch an offensive aimed directly at Berlin, and launch it soon. The main planning conference was last week on the 1st, with the State Defense Committee, Alexei Antonov, Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konev, and Sergei Stemenko, chief of the main operations directorate, in attendance. Here's what happens there. Now, Dwight Eisenhower sent Stalin a telegram 2 weeks ago saying the Western Allies were planning an attack towards Leipzig and Dresden, not Berlin, to split Germany in half. However, Stalin has Stemenko read a telegram. This says the opposite, that the Western Allies are about to launch an operation designed to reach Berlin before the Red Army, that Montgomery is getting ready to lead the assault from north of the Ruhr. Konev says the Red Army will reach Berlin first. Konev had risen too readily to the bait, and Stalin swung on him, asking him how he could regroup his forces in time when the bulk of his striking power was dispersed to the southern left flank. Konev promised timely reorganization, while Zhukov tersely reported that his front was ready to take Berlin and pointed straight at the city. Antonov goes over the operational plans. From Stettin in the north to Görlitz in the south, 3 fronts will attack on several axes, with long-range bomber support. They will cut the enemy into several groups, destroy them, and take Berlin. And 12 to 15 days after the whole thing begins, they'll reach the Elbe River and there link up with the Western Allies. They have to get this going soon, so there's only 2 weeks or so to prepare. Remember, I'm talking about a meeting that took place on the 1st. More specifically, Zhukov's front will make 3 attacks along a 100-kilometer stretch, destroying German 9th Army along the approaches to Berlin, then storm the city. The main attack of those 3 will be from the Oder bridgehead west of Kustrin. The other 2 will be one towards Eberswalde and one towards Potsdam and Brandenburg, which would prevent German reinforcement of the city. The artillery minimum of 250 big guns per kilometer means 1 every 4 meters, which boggles the mind. Konev's front is to hit 4th Panzer Army near Cottbus, then drive to the Elbe from Wittenberg down to Dresden. This should take no more than 12 days. He will have the same artillery density as Zhukov, and a supporting attack towards Dresden will give cover. The 3rd front is Konstantin Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian front, but he was not invited to the conference. Stavka just sends him orders that he is to regroup his forces so he can change sectors with Zhukov's right flank armies, and do so no later than April 15th to 18th. Basically, he takes over from Kolberg to Schwedt, which reduces Zhukov's frontage and allows him to concentrate on Berlin. That is, though, a tall order, since Rokossovsky has been fighting towards the east lately, Gdynia and Danzig, so he has to swing all of his armies westward and then cross like 350 kilometers of the land he just laid waste to. Tanks have to go by train, but that's painfully slow, so everything is moving day and night and day. There's another matter to consider here, one a bit more delicate. Back in November, Stalin designated Zhukov as conqueror of Berlin. These plans now seem to be in keeping with that, but for many weeks now, the General Staff has been trying to figure out how to coordinate Zhukov's and Konev's operations. What's the boundary line between them? And if Konev is totally shut out of the Berlin operation, might that not make the operation a whole lot harder? Konev is not happy with this either, and he wants his tanks to hit the southwestern Berlin suburbs. Only Stalin could decide a matter of this magnitude. The result was a cunning compromise. He deleted the boundary line between the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts running from the Nysa to Potsdam, the line penciled in on the General Staff operations map and which effectively barred Konya from Berlin. Stalin now let it run only as far as Lublin, just short of 40 miles from the German capital, and then announced, "Whoever breaks in first, let him take Berlin." So, although the odds are heavily on Zhukov, this does in fact allow Konyev to race him for the city with at least a fighting chance, without really nullifying what Stalin said last November. Actually, Stalin even advises Konyev to at least prepare an operational variation whereby 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies do attack Berlin from the south after they've broken through the German lines on the Nysa, though they'd have to pass Lublin before they could do so. Stalin signs the directives to Zhukov, Konyev, and Rokossovsky the 1st, 2nd, and 6th. It must be said, however, that in spite of their big talk, both Konyev and Zhukov are somewhat stunned by the logistical efforts that getting this launched is going to take. And launch day is April 16th, 3 days from today. Rokossovsky gets his launch date pushed back to the 20th, since his logistical efforts are even crazier. And what about Berlin itself and its defenses? Soviet planes fly a bunch of photo recon missions over the city. Berlin presented a formidable obstacle, 320 square miles of urban sprawl. A giant hedgehog with a huge number of strong points provided by the substantial buildings, as well as the underground facilities and installations, which could be put to good use by the defenders. Improvised anti-tank barriers sprouted from the jumble of bomb-blasted concrete, rubble, and abandoned vehicles, linking up the lakes and rivers which formed natural tank traps. Immediately ahead of Zhukov lay the Zilov Heights, 200 feet high in places, with carefully prepared fortifications and German guns sighted atop the plateau to cover all approaches, particularly the valley intersected with numerous streams and filled with soft ground. Well, all last week and this week they have been busy like never before, preparing for a mammoth offensive against Berlin with over 190 divisions, over 2.5 million men, over 6,000 tanks, over 7,500 planes, over 40,000 big guns and mortars, and nearly 100,000 vehicles strong. Stalin also writes back to Roosevelt and Churchill this week, before Roosevelt dies, refuting their rebuttal of the charge he made last week that they're making some sort of deal with the Germans so they can bring force from Italy and the Western Front to fight the Soviets in the East. He writes that the Germans could easily bring 15 or even 20 divisions from east to west, but they don't. They fight furiously for meaningless towns in the east, but give up Mannheim and Kassel in the west without even firing a shot. Something must be going on. They must be trying to make a separate deal. As for the endless issues about Poland between Stalin and those two, he does agree that they have reached an impasse, but blames them for ignoring the Yalta Agreement that only Poles willing to accept it, and accept things like the Curzon Line being the new border, and also committed to friendly relations with the USSR, could be invited for consultation on the Polish provisional government. Churchill has said there's way too much secrecy going on with regard to Poland. Stalin writes, actually, there is no secrecy at all. At the beginning of April, in one momentous week, Stalin sieved the whole of his strategy through his fingers. Showing the strain of war, Stalin seemed to prey to conflicting pressures and contradictory emotions. The vengeful mood which filled the Russian mind at large, the rights of Russia and the honor due to her, the freedom to secure Russia's security interests in Eastern Europe, born of a massive military presence and power, a knowing suspiciousness that the British would clamp a cordon sanitaire once again around the Soviet Union, and paranoia about secret deals which would deprive Russia of the spoils of Germany and sabotage Russia's claim to power and prestige in a morass of intrigue and dingy dealing. Well, Stalin's forces are still taking prize after prize in the field. In fact, this week both Königsberg and Vienna fall. Last week ended with Alexander Vasilevsky's forces battering down the German defenses in Königsberg and continuing the fight all through the night. A fiery prelude to the storm of fire poured over the city the following day. Königsberg was doomed, and the mass of civilians, mixed with the fighting troops, could not fail to be seized with terror amidst this military cremation stoked quite mercilessly by the Red Army. It really is a hellscape, made worse by the full weight of Novikov's air armies descending on the city. On the 6th, when the assault began, the bombers had only managed 85 out of over 1,200 planned sorties. More than 500 bombers fly the 7th, though, dropping 550 tons of bombs, blasting whole buildings to dust. However, the Germans do not give in, and they continue the fight from underground bunkers and fortified strongpoints. On the 8th, the Soviets send in 6,000 sorties, but the Soviet ground attacks pressing forward from both the north and the south of the city mean the danger of Soviet air power hitting Soviet troops is growing. Garrison Commander Otto Lasch asks 4th Army Commander Friedrich Wilhelm Müller for permission to evacuate into Samland. But this was refused, and by the time it is finally granted this week, Königsberg is cut off from Samland. Well, with his forces and the local population trapped under a continuous bombardment, Lasch signs a surrender at 9:30 the evening of the 9th. The morning of the 10th, the German columns assemble to be marched into captivity. The Soviets claim 42,000 soldiers killed and 92,000 POWs, including 1,800 officers. Some 25,000 civilians died, trapped without any hope of escape. Lasch is sentenced in absentia by Hitler to death, and his family is arrested. Müller is removed as commander of 4th Army and is replaced by von Sauken. Well, sort of. What's left of 4th and 2nd Armies will combine to form the Army of East Prussia. What the Germans have left in East Prussia is Group Samland. This is like 65,000 men, 160 or so tanks in various states of repair. 5 Soviet armies begin the attack to destroy them and capture Pillau. They begin the attack today as the week ends. As for Vienna, the fight for Vienna, which began at the end of last week, continues as this one begins. By the 8th, the Soviets have finally fought their way at least close to the city center, taking the arsenal and both the south and east railway stations. There are also Austrian resistance members guiding Soviet armor towards the city center, and others even actively shooting at the Germans. The Germans respond with public hangings, but this doesn't do much but add to the panic and the chaos. The city itself is burning and being ground to pieces, of course, as the Soviets slowly batter their way into it. But as long as the massive Reichsbrücke stays intact, German survivors can reach the north bank of the Danube. Still, today, April 13th, Vienna is declared free of Axis forces. Stavka issues new orders to Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front. His center and left will aim for Graz, his right for St. Polten. 6th Guards Tank Army are returned to Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front, and Tolbukhin takes control of the Danube Flotilla. If you think, however, that the German defenses in this part of Europe must be completely smashed, just realize that even today, the 13th, 6th Panzer, 6th, and 2nd Panzer armies managed to have a continuous defense line from just west of St. Polten down to the Drava River east of Varaždin. Over on Okinawa, the American advances, after landings back on the 1st, are finally this week starting to meet the Japanese defense lines. I should point out here that there are further kamikaze attacks and operations against the fleet off Okinawa. And next month, I have a special covering all of those operations chronologically, since I don't have time to really get to them in depth in these episodes. Anyhow, Okinawa. The 7th and 96th Infantry Division's drive southward is halted until the 8th, though even when it begins again, they don't take enemy positions on the kilometer-long Kakazu Ridge until the 12th. Stalemate sets in on the ridge, but the Japanese, they haven't really been fighting back much at all. Chafing at their defensive strategy, the more aggressive Japanese officers clamored for a counterattack. Colonel Yahara held them at bay, reasoning that even if the counterattack was successful, the troops would be exposed to massive American firepower on the plains. However, with the American advance southward stalling, Japanese commander Mitsuru Ushijima gives in, and a counterattack is launched on the 12th. It's weak, and uncoordinated, especially since some commanders, well aware of what I just said, hold back their troops. It's still in progress as the week ends, though it will end before dawn tomorrow, with the Japanese taking far more casualties than the Americans. The latter plan to hit the main Shuri defenses, which are on much more rugged ground. The Marine attacks northwards, which began at the end of last week, initially meet little resistance, though the Japanese have laid mines and blown bridges. There are not very many roads in the north, and the terrain is pretty tough. And on the 8th, the Marines decide the Japanese must be concentrating on the Motobu Peninsula on the upper west coast of the island. The Marines patrolled across the base of it over the rest of the week, with resistance increasing as the Marines move west, but no real actual battle. The Japanese are having a battle this week in China, though. On the 7th, thousands of Japanese troops begin moving west along the river from Xiangyang. They do make some advances over the next few days, but the Chinese 22nd Army Group hits them hard and not only drives them back, but disorders them. The 5th War Area orders a pursuit, and by the middle of next week, has not only driven them back to Xiangyang, has taken it and Fangcheng and basically restored the status quo as it was 3 weeks ago before the whole Japanese operation began. The Japanese are on defense in Burma and Luzon. Frank Messervy's 4th Corps is making a long dash south for Rangoon in Burma, but this week they hit their first well-defended real Japanese roadblock at Piaobue. 255th Tank Brigade cuts the road south of Piaobue the 10th, and though a first assault on the town fails, repeated ones that devolve into bloody hand-to-hand combat take it by the morning of the 11th with 2,000 dead Japanese. But this is a milestone. British 14th Army Commander Bill Slim himself has this to say. For its size, Piaobue was one of the most decisive battles of the Burma War. It shattered Honda's army, but it did more. It settled the fate of Rangoon. Well, we'll see about that, because at Yamatin, just south of Piaobue, it takes till the end of the week for 5th Division to wipe out a 400-strong enemy suicide squad and get going again. I have not had time to talk about the clearing of Luzon on the Philippines lately, but it continues. U.S. 6th Infantry Division kept up the fight against the Shimbu Group in late March, turning their attention to the Wawa Dam. They have been unable to dislodge the Japanese so far, though, and it looks like the fight might continue quite a while. The attacks against Tomoyuki Yamashita's large Shobu Group in the north stalled in late March, especially the drive to take Baguio, and that whole region stubbornly remains in Japanese hands. And here, I will end my coverage of this week of the war. With Allied advances on Okinawa and in Burma, Königsberg and Vienna falling to the Soviets, a new Allied offensive in Italy, the hundreds of thousands of Germans in the Ruhr pocket being squeezed ever more tightly, and the death of the American president. And only one of those things seems to have much of an effect on German high command. The last one, Roosevelt's death, which provokes wild joy and apparently the belief that this is going to somehow turn the war around. And they're going to defend Berlin, and they're going to take back Vienna, though the Soviets have 2.5 million men poised for a drive on Berlin. You know, everyone occasionally has moments of fantasy. Heck, some people live their lives in a little fantasy world. But to actually witness the gargantuan fantasy of Hitler's, this grotesque dream that takes tens of thousands of lives a week, but that the Germans are somehow going to turn it around and win. But it's not a dream, is it? Not really. Because Hitler knows reality. He can see what's happening. Back on March 29th, Albert Speer sent Hitler a memorandum summarizing their communications from March 18th. On that date, Speer sent Hitler a memo explaining he really didn't want to pursue the scorched earth plan of destroying German industry and infrastructure which Hitler had ordered. It should be spared for the future, and when they met that evening, Hitler told Speer this: "If the war is lost, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. There is no necessity to take into consideration the basis which the people would need to continue a most primitive existence. On the contrary, it is better to destroy these things ourselves, because this nation will have proved to be the weaker one, and the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. Besides, those who will remain after the battle will only be the inferior ones, for the good ones have then been killed. It is victory or total annihilation. And Hitler knows the war is lost. He has no fantasy that they're somehow going to win. So he will order the fight to continue until all of the good ones have been killed and the nation perishes. As I said at the beginning, this episode was dedicated by Time Ghost Army Brigadier Randy Warmeister to his parents Grace and William, who served in the Dutch resistance. When the Germans invaded the Netherlands, Grace was 14 and William was 15. Grace's father was a police officer, and he went to fight the invasion. 5 days later, he returned saying, "It is over, they won." Despite their young age, both decided to resist. Grace worked as a telephone operator in her hometown of Groningen. She hid her ability to speak German and passed information to the resistance. When her area was liberated, she translated and provided information to the Allies. The Germans ordered William to work in the factories, but he escaped and found refuge on a farm near his hometown of Terborg. The farmer there enjoyed playing Monopoly, which William disliked, but played anyhow to maintain favor. Post-war, he would not play again. I really like that detail. During the war, when he had the chance, he got some vengeance by pushing German soldiers into canals. Both Grace and William witnessed the horrors of the occupation. Grace saw her Jewish neighbor killed, and she stacked the frozen bodies of those who died of starvation during the hunger winter of 1944-45. Randy recalls, "She said she would never forget that last winter, the constant cold, the hunger. Through it all, though, they had each other." Lacking identity papers, William risked his life traveling to see Grace. They would sit together while her father smoked his pipe. When the Allies arrived on April 15, 1945, William and about 400 others joined up with the 1st Canadian Corps near the town of Alten. They served as the Dutch National Battalion, and the Queen of the Netherlands later awarded William a medal. Grace and William married and emigrated to the United States in 1951. They lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and had 4 children. William died in 2004, but Grace is still going strong at 97. The family has a long tradition of military service. William's father fought in the Great War, William in World War II, and our Brigadier Randy served for 20 years as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. If you would like to memorialize an episode of this series, you can do so by joining the Time Ghost Army at Brigadier level for 1 year, or by making a one-time donation. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.